Representative Castro's gone now, but didn't know what he was going to say today. Lots of profound thoughts, I think, in there, and clearly he is trying to think through a lot of the issues that we will also be talking about here as well. I told my panelists they could only have 5 minutes, and I said I would only take 5, so I need to make sure that I try to hold true to that. Hi, I'm Jeff Abramson. I help lead something called the Forum on the Arms Trade, one of the co-sponsors. The Forum is a network of experts around the world who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues from a side of, I would say, concern. I was on the subway in today, and I don't have proof of this, but I think Washington, D.C. is the only place you can go to subway stops where the defense industry is marketing their materials. Very much don't question them having any concerns about them, but about their force projection and their ability to keep you safe. I think a lot of us in our community question some of those things, talk about those things. I think that's what one of the goals for this conference is, to have people get to know each other across communities. So one of the goals for this panel is to give you a feel for some of the people in the arms trade space and some of the issues we work on. I created a laundry list of things we could talk about today, which was much longer than we will cover in this panel. But I wanted to just, so that others don't have to do it, a lot of you are familiar with some of the law that exists, and when Congressman Castro was talking about Congress not living up to it, I think for a lot of us, we looked at the law. We have lots of good law. We find it's not being used. But I want to just give you a quick laundry list of some of them, so maybe John doesn't have to do it. But a lot of you have heard of the Leahy Law. Obviously, this is probably globally the most known U.S. provision. It is used much more smallly than it was originally envisioned. I would say now we use it around human rights abuses by units of forces that receive training, but it could be much more expansive. Then underlying our law is the Foreign Assistance Act and the Arms Export Control Act, which Congress used to define what's the purpose of the arms trade. And importantly, under the FAA, the Foreign Assistance Act, it prohibits security assistance to countries with a consistent pattern of gross human rights violations. Also part of the FAA are some provisions which haven't been getting a lot of attention, but in the last 5 years, I'd say, from our community has been elevating. So there's 502B, which provides for human rights reports, which can lead to a cessation of arms transfers. I believe also out of 502 comes the genesis of the human rights reports. The human rights reports, as many of you work on, actually came out of trying to live up to these goals on arms exports. More recently, there's been 620I, another provision of the FAA, which prohibits the provision of assistance to places that stop the delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance. So obviously, in relation to Gaza and Israel, we have seen that come into fore. It's been around a long time, but hasn't been used very much. And then in our issue space also, there is Congress, and there is some transparency around notification. So before weapons go out the door, there is a period where Congress can pass a joint resolution of disapproval. This is in many ways to the public the most transparent, but not always particularly transparent moment, and often the time when you will see efforts to stop an arms transfer. But in reality, Congress could act at any time until something is delivered to stop it from going. So that is kind of, I don't know, 2-minute overview of the law that we sometimes talk about. But obviously, in today's times, we are really concerned about where some of our weapons are going, and that's what we'll be talking about. Obviously, we have Israel and Saudi Arabia are some common examples. But as a big picture, just to let you know, the United States is, by far, the largest exporter of weapons in the world. The latest SIPRI reports, which uses 5-year metrics, found from 2020 to 2024, the United States accounted for 43% of the global major arms market, which is about the combined total of the next 8 countries. And it's rising. I don't expect it to stop rising under the Trump administration, and we supplied weapons to 107 states in that time period. Just to give you a feel for what some of us who see those ads in the subway are up against, the extent of what we're talking about. Okay, thanks so much. I'm going to introduce, I've told the panelists to please just spend 5 minutes talking about the, sort of a core issue to them, and then we'll do a round of questions. We might cut this a little short because we're running late, but we also want to open it up to the audience. I will introduce them as they start, but I'm going to start with, to my left, with Elizabeth Rghebi, I got it right, all right, who's the MENA Advocacy Director at Amnesty International USA. I won't preface what you're going to talk about, just turn it over to you to give us some thoughts. Thanks.
You already on?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Thanks, Jeff, for moderating, and looking forward to the discussion with my colleagues today. For my remarks, I plan to focus a bit on how Amnesty investigates violations of international humanitarian law and the role of our work in identifying U.S. weapons, broader patterns of violations within conflict. Our work spans a number of different issues across the globe with respect to conflict. So I have colleagues that work on Sudan. I work on Yemen, looking at U.S. strikes in the Caribbean and Pacific. But for my remarks, I'm going to focus on Israel and the U.S. role in providing weapons and continuing to provide military support, which has been a key area of my work personally for over 2 years with Amnesty. So to set the stage, there are broader concerns with respect to compliance with international law in this case. Over a year ago, Amnesty concluded that the Israeli government was committing genocide against Palestinians in the occupied Gaza Strip. And so this is also occurring under an umbrella of broader violations that we continue to be very concerned about, and also contribute to our push for a comprehensive arms embargo within this context. And so that is the ongoing illegal occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, as well as an overarching apartheid system that impacts the Palestinian people as a whole, both within Israel, within the OPT, and for refugees that continue to be denied the right of return. Within our work with respect to the U.S. government over the last 2 years, and this is true not only in this context, but we really lead research first. We have amazing experts within a variety of different areas, both regional experts, weapons experts, our digital experts that analyze satellite imagery, video, photographs, experts that collect testimony from survivors and witnesses, and of course our legal experts that conduct the legal analysis onto what international laws are applicable and which ones we deem to have been violated within specific attacks, as well as the broader patterns. With respect to Gaza specifically, Palestinian human rights organizations continue to document on the ground, but Amnesty is one of the only international organizations that has people on the ground. We have field workers that have done incredible work, and it is due to their work that we've been able to identify U.S. weapons when they've been used in unlawful attacks by Israeli forces against Palestinian civilians within Gaza. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of that research, kind of broadly, and then kind of touch on how we've seen our work and the engagement that we've done towards the U.S. government, what that impact has been, what challenges there are towards seeing concrete policy change, which it's far short of what we would like to see at this point, and I think connects with a lot of the comments that Congressman Castro was making in his keynote. But Amnesty has documented a number of different airstrikes, ground attacks by Israeli forces. In particular, our teams documented 15 different airstrikes by Israeli forces in Gaza. These attacks hit residential homes, a church, a market, and other civilian locations. In each specific instance, Amnesty identified that a war crime had been committed. And then when you zoom out, and our teams did a legal analysis of the broader pattern, some different trends emerged. One, of course, these were civilian objects. Two, high civilian casualty and injury rates, including children. The attacks occurred either late at night or early in the morning, when families would settle in for the evening, and would result in higher death rates and injury rates, which our teams assessed was the likely intended outcome. And that analysis, that pattern of attack, formed a core part of our overall evidence and analysis that led us to conclude that the crime of genocide was being committed by the Israeli government. One more minute, okay. So in leading with our engagement with both the executive branch and Congress, we really lead with our evidence. I think within this context, the evidence is quite frankly overwhelming, not only from Amnesty's investigations, but the reporting from other organizations, the media reporting and so forth. But I think the challenge that we continue to come up against is due to a few reasons. One, just a lack of political will. We've seen some significant shifts, important shifts within Congress, but it's not been enough to see actual policy change. We haven't seen legislation passed that would restrict or limit the transfer of weapons, even though there have been efforts to try to do so. They haven't been successful yet. Likewise, some of the laws that were being mentioned, if they were applied in good faith, would be sufficient to see the stemming of this flow of weapons. That has also not taken place. And I think, there are a variety of other reasons we could go through why we haven't seen these political changes, but I think I'll just kind of conclude in saying that anti-Palestinian racism continues to be quite pervasive within U.S. policymaking, and that's another key reason that we're not seeing the changes that we would need to see. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And as you can imagine, within our community, the last 2 years has been 2.5 years has been really focused on this topic, and we really wanted to provide some sense of how the evidence is gathered and how some of the people who are doing this and try to move that forward to policy change and the challenges. I want to turn next to Elias Yousif, who is a fellow and deputy director of the Conventional Defense Program at the Stimson Center, who I've worked with for many years, but I turn it over to you for some thoughts. We had a couple things, so I'm not quite sure what you're going to start with.
Yeah, big thanks to Jeff. I 5 minutes, I'm going to keep it as brief as I can, but a big thanks to the forum for hosting this event and giving me the opportunity. And I also want to reiterate the thanks to Representative Castro for his consistent, long-standing leadership on advancing a more responsible U.S. arms trade, which I think is an issue that doesn't get the attention that it's due, really. And I understand that in the grand scheme of U.S. foreign policy and all the things that are going on, the arms trade and the U.S. arms trade can seem like a niche issue. But I think the panelists will agree, and probably the people in this room would agree, that it is often one of the most profoundly consequential instruments of U.S. foreign policy, as we've just heard. And precisely because the consequences are so profound, it's what makes effective oversight, regulation, research, and guardrails so important. But for oversight and accountability to work, fundamentally, you need meaningful and intentional transparency. I think this relates very closely to the idea of the right to reality that Representative Castro made and the age of knowing, and it's what I want to talk about today, transparency. For those who know me, it is my soapbox. And transparency is one of the core tenets of democratic governance, as we all know, and has an especially important role to play in the arms trade that touches on so many aspects of national security. But as I'm sure many of you will know, the reality is that the current state of U.S. arms trade transparency is bad and getting worse. In almost all the areas that you can imagine, public information on U.S. security cooperation and assistance is either not available, does not exist, which is very troubling, is provided in a way that is not analytically useful or useful for advocacy or oversight. And in the cases where it is provided, it is increasingly less detailed and more aggregated. I'm not going to go over all of these examples in just 5 minutes, but some of them you will be familiar with. That may be as simple as the fact that direct commercial sales notifications or commercial arms sales notifications that are made to Congress are not made public. The fact that the statutorily mandated annual reports on U.S. arms transfers every year are increasingly aggregated, less detailed, and we can look at side-by-side examples of what that looks like, or the fact that there is an effective absence of meaningful data on the myriad of Defense Department-led military aid programs. And even in just the last few months, we've seen changes that have eroded what's left of some of this transparency. In the FY 2026 congressional budget justification for the State Department, the Trump administration elected to remove the detailed tables at the end of the document. And I understand that that seems like a rather wonky or obscure change, but in reality, it eliminated one of the only public sources of data and information at a country level for billions of dollars worth of security sector assistance. And earlier this summer, lawmakers introduced a bill that would raise the dollar value that triggers a congressional notification for an arms sale, which would effectively push millions of dollars of arms sales below the table and away from public and congressional scrutiny. And this is especially true for some of the weapons that actually place the most harm on civilians, small arms and light weapons. And so, what makes this all the more frustrating for me personally, and I understand that this is a cliche thing to say in this town, but transparency should not be a partisan issue. Fundamentally, transparency is about empowering all stakeholders with the information to make informed policy choices, engage in informed debate, and conduct informed oversight, which is something that should appeal to liberals and conservatives, hawks and doves, and everybody in between. And so, whether you, as I do, believe that the United States really needs to adopt a stronger policy of restraint for U.S. arms transfers, or if you believe that the United States, as the world's largest arms exporter, is somehow too conservative in its approach, transparency simply provides you with the tools to consider those positions and the consequences with data and evidence, and I just can't imagine that we wouldn't all want that. But unfortunately, both Democratic and Republican administrations have defaulted to an assumption of secrecy for a number of reasons that we can talk about in the Q&A. But that secrecy silos this information in increasingly narrow corridors of government and deprives civil society, lawmakers, and even other government agencies from the information they need to ensure that their equities are represented and, critically, that their expertise are represented. And the result is that decisions surrounding security cooperation and assistance are not made using the best evidence, the best research, or the best policy insights, and is why I don't think we should be surprised how frequently security cooperation partnerships fail to deliver returns for U.S. interests. And I'm hoping we can explore in the Q&A how that lack of rigor also contributes to assumptions and flawed understandings of how this works. We can talk about if we don't sell, somebody else will assumptions, the idea that transparency jeopardizes operational security. The list could go on. But so rather than treating transparency as a political wedge or as some submission of the executive branch to another branch of government, I think we should understand transparency as an investment in raising the standards of this profoundly consequential enterprise. An investment that, again, I think should appeal to everybody. But given the trajectory of the path that we have been on for many years, I do feel like what is left of transparency is indeed in jeopardy, and especially given the changes we've seen over the last couple of months. And because I remain skeptical that this administration or any other administration would engage in transparency on its own volition, I do think, as Representative Contra said, it is time for Congress to step up to reclaim the oversight role that is enshrined in law, or at least was intended to be enshrined in law, and also to enable the engagement of a broader community of stakeholders looking to advance a more responsible arms trade. I'll stop there. I think that was 5 minutes.
I stopped keeping track, sorry. Thank you, Elias. I'm really glad I really wanted to invite Elias to talk because I think he and the others on the panel would say we've had to make the argument of why transparency matters increasingly often over the last few years, which is a particularly alarming development, I would say. I want to turn finally to John Ramey Chappell, who is the U.S. Advocacy and Legal Advisor at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. And also, Elizabeth and Elias and I are important, but if you're not part of our community, you want to know one person, John's that person to know. I hope John doesn't mind me saying talk to John, but John helps also lead the Arms Sales Accountability Project, which is really how a lot of us in Washington, D.C. are organized on arms trade issues. So in your different communities, one of the things that's really helpful, I find, in building partnerships is knowing who to talk to. So John is one of those people. I'm happy to talk as well, but John, over to you. Put a little pressure on you there, but some big picture thoughts from you as well. Thanks.
Is this on? Yeah, it is. Great. Thank you, Jeff. That's a very generous introduction, and thanks to Elizabeth and Elias and our hosts, Amnesty International USA, our co-hosts, Forum on the Arms Trade and the Anti-Corruption Advocacy Network, and to Congressman Castro, who's a rare voice of moral clarity in the U.S. Congress. I want to make a case to you, tell you a story, you might say, in 3 parts. It's going to be a 5-minute story. And essentially what I want to do today is situate the arms trade in a broader conversation about the rule of law. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Congress has enacted laws to restrict and condition U.S. arms transfers and security assistance. I'm going to make the case to you that Congress has done a lot, and much of what it can do in order to try to enforce those laws through the mechanisms that it has. And then I'm going to try to convince you that despite what Congress has done, it hasn't been enough. and it has to revisit the very structures that form the basis for US arms transfer and security assistance and restructure them to take back the authority that it has in the US Constitution. Jeff very kindly covered some of the content that I would otherwise have to. I'm a lawyer focused on the arms trade, and so I spend a lot of time with laws in the United States that restrict or condition US arms sales and security assistance on facilitation of humanitarian access, that restrict based on whether units of foreign security forces have committed a gross violation of human rights, or whether a country has engaged in a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. Also, whether a country has engaged in a consistent pattern of harassment or intimidation of people within the United States. And I could go on, because at the country-specific level, there are a number of other restrictions that Congress has put in place. And putting these restrictions in place is well within Congress's constitutional authorities. You might have tracked debates about war powers and the division between the role of the president or the executive branch and the Congress in conducting war. You don't hear as much about the arms trade constitutionally, because the truth is it's not very complicated. It all belongs to Congress. Whether it is the Foreign Commerce Clause, which gives Congress the authority to regulate commerce outside of the United States, exports, or whether it is the power of the purse and the Appropriations Clause, which is where we get a lot of the underlying authorities dealing with foreign aid and security assistance. And so, especially since the 1970s, Congress has enacted laws that are on the books still, that have, in some circumstances, significantly affected US policymaking. But Congress has constantly been up against an executive branch that wants to resist constraint, an executive branch that tries to interpret law into nullity when it is convenient to do so. And so we've seen that many of the most important and most consequential laws in the United States dealing with the arms trade are implemented inconsistently, with significant gaps, are not complied with, or don't even have processes attached to them in the US executive branch to try to comply with them. And thanks to the organizations within the US government and outside of the US government that have done a lot of work, including journalists, to try to shed light on these issues. Now, Congress has tried to push back and to advance the rule of law in the US arms trade. A lot of what we've seen recently is in the case of US arms transfers to Israel that have contributed to widespread atrocity crimes in Gaza. And thank you to Elizabeth for speaking about this, which I think has been among the most important moral and policy questions of our time. It has drawn more eyes to issues of the arms trade than I think have been on this issue in a number of decades. And it's emblematic of broader patterns in US policy and the rule of law. So how has Congress tried to step in? One of the main points of confrontation in recent years has been privileged vehicles, so vehicles in Congress that have a fast track to a vote on the floor, that then create an opportunity for debate around specific arms transfers. These are called joint resolutions of disapproval, and they're provided for in Section 36 of the Arms Export Control Act. The Arms Export Control Act was meant to be a constraining force. It was meant to limit what the US executive branch could do without Congress knowing about it. It came during a time of unfettered US arms sales to Iran that had really significant implications for US policy in the Middle East. However, since the 1980s, this law has been less effective than it could be because of a Supreme Court decision that essentially has resulted in a situation where in order to block an arms sale through this mechanism, Congress needs to muster a 2/3 majority. When's the last time that Congress agreed with a 2/3 majority on anything meaningful in foreign policy? I think it's been a while, especially when it comes to 2 minutes left. Awesome, okay, I'm doing okay then. It's been a while. And so Congress has also tried to find other mechanisms to trigger meaningful debate of the US arms trade and US security cooperation, including through Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which allows for the requirement for the Department of State to produce a report on the human rights record of another country. This has been increasingly used alongside Arms Export Control Act, Joint Resolution of Disapproval, but in the nearly 50-year, actually it might be 51 years now, history of the Arms Export Control Act, a Joint Resolution of Disapproval has never been the mechanism that has stopped an arms transfer from going forward. That is despite the fact, and let's revisit what I said a minute ago, that under the Constitution, the inherent authority to regulate the arms trade belongs to the US Congress. So, that's why I'm trying to convince you that the Congress needs to rewrite the rules, because they can and they should. And it's not okay that the very structures that govern one of the most significant tools of US foreign policy are broken. Congressman Castro spoke about Congress's dereliction of their duty around human rights and around US foreign policy. I think this is one of the biggest places where Congress indeed has to do more and has to restructure the framework base of US national security separation of powers. One way that it can do that is by, instead of requiring a 2/3 majority to stop an arms sale from going forward, they can flip that on its head and instead require affirmative authority from Congress for arms sales to proceed. They can do that in bundles. They can do that in ways that don't require an overly burdensome number of votes. But as we're thinking today in the United States about the rule of law and US national security policy, whether that's national emergencies, war powers, or the arms trade, I think that's the conversation we have to be ready to have, is what should we be doing to rewrite the script of what the relationship between Congress and the executive branch is when it comes to these security policies. I think the arms trade is a good place to start. All eyes are on it. In the past 10 years, we've seen more and more of these debates on the floor, whether it's regarding arms transfers in the context of the war in Yemen, atrocities in Sudan, or atrocities in Gaza. But we have to revisit the basics. We have to be comfortable with rewriting the basic law that underlies this relationship, and doing so will make it easier to prevent corruption, promote human rights, and push for greater restraint. Thank you.
Let me thank our panelists for the first go-round. We are running a little behind schedule after Representative Castro, but I'm not going to ask the 3 questions I had in our planning, but I'll ask, John has already sort of talked about some recommendations moving ahead. So maybe Elias and Elizabeth, if you have some recommendations you want to share at this point, and then I'll turn it over real quickly to questions from the audience. Either of you, if you want to go first.
I can start if you want.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think mine are relatively specific, and again, they relate obviously to transparency, as you might suspect. But I think that there are some simple steps that would be profoundly impactful in improving transparency, and I think in creating better political conditions for restraint. I think so much gets to happen behind closed doors, which robs the public of the ability to hold their representatives accountable, their government accountable. And so I do think that there's an ecosystemic effect when you improve transparency that adds to restraint. I think one would be making all notifications for arms transfers public and listing them very clearly in a searchable way, so that way none of this is happening behind closed doors. I would certainly not suggest that we raise notification thresholds. I would suggest lowering them. And I think, really importantly, I think that to John's point, there needs to be specific legislation around what is required for reporting, and not just what is required, but how it's required to be delivered. We've seen over and over again that reporting requirements in the AECA, in the FAA, that are produced are increasingly produced almost as a perfunctory action, as a box-checking exercise, and over the last 10 years, they have become analytically worthless. I used to run a database that tracked U.S. arms transfers and security sector assistance, and we used to depend on this to create robust research on the efficacy of partnerships. Today, those documents don't give me much of anything anymore. And so I think being, as John said, willing to rewrite the rules and be very specific about what Congress is demanding, not just for itself, but for the public, and allowing civil society to be a force multiplier in their consideration of those policy issues.
Thanks. I think for me, I agree with the recommendations that have been made. I think going to a number of John's points, the need for Congress to kind of retake its authority and to be more proactive. When I think about the shifts, and they have been important, but like I was saying before, none of it is sufficient to end the genocide or to end the violations that we've been seeing committed against Palestinians. But when we look at the joint resolution of disapproval of votes, these were important, but they're also very reactive mechanisms, an attempt by Congress to block a sale that's already been approved. So these things are not proactive. They're not getting at the root of the problem, which is the mass appropriation of funding for ongoing military aid to the Israeli government. So I think that is something key. Now, there is a bill that's been introduced within the House that is proactive to limit 7 types of weapons to the Israeli government, but that is still kind of a limited measure. It's not encompassing the full range of military and security assistance that Israel receives, which would be critical to stem towards seeing a decrease or ideally, a complete halting of the violations that we're documenting. I think another challenge that we see that I would really like to see kind of shift is, when we're having these engagements, and we've been talking about the documentation, I think there's a tendency of policymakers to want to focus on a specific attack or a specific type of weapon, and it becomes this very myopic kind of view, rather than wanting to take a step back and look at the bigger picture, look at the patterns that are taking place, Whether or not a U.S. weapon is identified in a specific attack, it's important to know, yes, but the pattern is more important. We're talking about transferring weapons into a situation where the risk is extremely, extremely high that it's going to be used in violation of international law. So the patterns are what needs to be taken into account. I think we found challenges. I think that's shifting, but I think, for a while with our conversations and meetings we were having, it was difficult to get kind of people to move past this very limited view. And I think the other challenge before us is just with this so-called ceasefire in place that I think a number of members of Congress will be very eager to try to return to the status quo. So kind of keeping the pressure on with respect to increasing scrutiny over weapons transfers in this context and others, that'll be the challenge before us. Thank you.
Great. And before I turn it over to the audience for questions, I hope there'll be a couple. I am trying to catch up a little bit, but I want to just share that in the audience today, we do have current and former members of the State Department. We have people from other embassies in the United States. So there's not necessarily everybody in here is going to agree with what we said up here on the panel, which is fine. But this is recorded. We will have a recording made, and it will be out live. So this is a public event, just so everyone knows. But I'd love to take a couple questions, if there are some from the audience. The question I had teed up the panel, which I did not ask, was how you make these cases to the average American, if such a person exists. How do you make this in sort of a domestic-focused conversation? How do you make these issues relevant? But I will save that unless, in hopes that we have some good questions. Great. Oh, yeah. And we have a microphone coming your way. Thank you.
Hey guys, thanks for being here. Scott McCann, John Quincy Adams Society. My question probably lives at the grand strategic level. of, I look at this issue as being a product and driver of a militarized foreign policy. And what I want to know is how much of the conversation, and if it exists, what does it look like around this issue of this being an issue of a foreign policy that revolves around primacy and militarism, and a issue that is focused on military sort of engagement with the world in general.
Let me see if there's another question in the audience before because we're going to consolidate. And we'll go to the behind you. Great audience participation. Handing over the microphone.
Raquel Ledgerwood, also with Amnesty. My question is kind of related. You kind of alluded to it, and I wanted to hear your more fleshed out thoughts about. My work is largely on China, and often the narrative is that race to the bottom that you alluded to, like if we don't do it, someone else will. So how do you counter that narrative with a rights-focused agenda and prioritizing the need to kind of have these ethics to maintain them, and how necessary the assumption that someone else, an actor like China or other adversaries, will fill that gap if the United States leaves, because the United States left in a lot of other areas earlier this year, and China did not fill that gap. So what is your response?
Okay, I know I saw two questions over here, but I'm afraid for time I'm going to skip them. But we do have a break after the next panel, so lots of conversation. You teed up if you don't sell them, someone else to Elias. Maybe I'll go into that first and then let John and Elizabeth
Sure,
jump
and
in.
I think these two questions are actually related, so it's really useful. I think I couldn't agree more about this securitization of U.S. foreign policy, and it has become one of the principal instruments of U.S. foreign engagement. And if you go and visit a number of these places where the United States has these relationships, it is, if you were coming as a member of the State Department, you get a different reception than if you're coming as a member representing, let's say, the Department of Defense, unless you're having something that you can bring in some cases. And certainly that was the case true in the Middle East when I was living there, and you just got a different reception when you were coming from the defense sector, because that was the principal means of engagement. But I think this relates also to this question of primacy and if we don't sell. And I think in response to if we don't sell, first, there's a number of reasons why that argument just doesn't hold water for me. One is more practical. It's just not easy for a country to switch over. It's like, you might have an entire suite of technology that is Apple-based. And if I went and gave you a wonky PC, your chargers wouldn't work, your iCloud's not gonna work, all of that stuff in a macro level just becomes a lot more complicated. There are billions of dollars in investment in logistics, sustainment infrastructure that are not easy to simply shift. It's not that it's not impossible, but it's a costly decision that has to be weighed by the recipient very carefully. And I think maybe more importantly, we are often talking about the risk of a partner transitioning to another supplier. There's two problems with that. One, the United States often assumes the maximum possible return for the adversary if that partner switches to them as a supplier, which is a little strange to me because we have the actual knowledge of knowing how difficult it is to translate security cooperation into leverage, strategic returns, influence. And so we assign a maximum level of return for that other supplier that we have never been able to enjoy. And secondly, the basis of analysis is on the risk of the partner transitioning rather than thinking about what is the risk of maintaining this partnership. And I think that mentality has meant that we have defense relationships with most of the globe. You mentioned 100-some countries that have received that CIPRI found. That's for large-scale arms transfer. That doesn't include small arms and light weapons. There's a very small list of people or countries that the United States does not provide arms to. And so in that context, we have conditioned people to believe that U.S. weaponry is guaranteed, that their behavior and their relationship to U.S. interests does not jeopardize those arms transfers and those partnerships. And so it does not surprise me that countries are going to say, well, we have been able to receive this assistance, we've gotten our weapons. Sure, the United States is asking for XYZ thing, but looking back historically, we have seen countries defy those expectations and receive very little in terms of conditionality or any sort of restraint. So I think what it does is it fuels a security cooperation enterprise that is even less likely to deliver returns on U.S. interests because nobody believes that we're going to meaningfully use that for leverage or influence.
Every year, the U.S. government puts out a year in review of U.S. arms sales. It's kind of like the Spotify Wrapped of the U.S. arms trade. And every year, there's a sense of pride that comes across from the U.S. government increasing the dollar value of the weapons it sells. How many weapons the United States sells, what its share of the of the global arms trade is, how many more weapons it sells than the next several major sellers of weapons, more than the next 7 combined. These are not good proxies for whether arms sales are serving U.S. interests, whether they are serving human rights, or whether they are contributing to better foreign policy. The assumption that more is better is wrong. More is not necessarily better when it comes to selling weapons, and in some cases, the US government's willing to admit that. In other cases, it's not. It's not to say that there should be no arms sales, period. That's not a position that my organization takes. I think that that's, even among advocates, probably not something that you'd find much of. But the assumption that larger numbers are better when it comes to weapons exports, I think is inaccurate. And it's based in assumptions that US dominance of the arms market, and let me actually change that a little bit, US private companies' dominance of the international arms market is good and desirable. I think a lot about something that the late President Jimmy Carter said a lot during his presidential run, which I will paraphrase. The United States can't be the world's largest purveyor of violence through weapons sales and the world's greatest advocate for peace. I think that that is true. Maybe not everyone does, but I hope there is strong agreement that that number of how many weapons the United States sells, the dollar value, is not a good indicator or an accurate proxy for whether US foreign policy is serving the American people well or not.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of comments. I think when we think about the flow of U.S. weapons and the role that plays within U.S. policy, I focus on the Middle East and North Africa, so that's definitely a key part in the way in which the U.S. government deals with the region. The amount of weapons flows are significant, not only to Israel, but to a number of the Gulf countries. And then beyond weapons transfers, you also have security cooperation, coordination, and training with a number of police forces or military units within a range of countries in the region that are responsible for human rights abuses. And so we just continue to see the focus on these relationships, right, having U.S. bases in the region, the militarization, and human rights is at the bottom of the list in a lot of cases, particularly with governments the U.S. considers to be allies versus the way it will engage with adversaries. But if human rights is on the list, it's usually towards the bottom.
Sorry we weren't very optimistic at the close here, but I think you can see the struggles that we're having, and we did have, I hope, some ideas for how to move forward in the future. I'm going to close us off here. I didn't quite capture back time, but I want to thank Elizabeth, Elias, and John for leading us. We didn't fully answer these questions. I will just float that one of the issues that Representative Castro briefly talked about, and we have not talked about, but is I think a lot of us are seized in our communities and across at least the human rights community, is the boat strikes that are happening in and around Venezuela and the potential war there. I think those are cross-cutting issues that we will see attention to moving forward in addition to the ones we talked about today. Thank you all very much. I know you've been sitting here for a bit. I'm going to ask you you can stand up if you want, but did Jody just leave? Okay, if I could ask the next panel to come on up, we will have a break after that one, but next we will start talking about some of the efforts around anti-corruption. So if that panel could come up, and if you could thank our panelists for this one.